going to talk to you today about managing risk in the education sector using data science. And actually there's a few things I'm going to pick up on that build on the first two presentations, which I thought were really good, and quite happily they didn't nick any of the slides that I was about to use, which was very good as well. I was a little worried in the M&S presentation for a little bit, but we're okay. So firstly, a bit of context as to why we're doing this. How school funding used to work and still works for a good chunk of the sector at the moment is the Department for Education, where I work, goes and gives money to local authorities. Those local authorities then give the money out to schools. That means if a school runs out of money for any particular reason, maybe its heating system breaks down unexpectedly, or if there are any issues with fraud or poor governance of funds, it is the local authority's job to manage that and sort that out, and they have the authority delegated down from the Department for Education. We now have the Academies programme, which gives schools greater independence and freedom with the work they do. And that means the department gives the money to those schools directly, all across the country. No longer goes via local authorities. Therefore, we no longer have the local authorities to manage those issues when they come up. If there's a fraud issue, it goes directly back to the department for being accountable. It goes directly back to ministers for being accountable around that. And since this is a flagship programme where you do have kind of small cases of issues happening with individual schools, those can often then be used as a way for people to try and make comment about the entire Academies programme as a whole. So this means we need to have an effective way of managing risk for all those academy schools that are out there. Now, I want to talk about responsibility a little bit because there's an interesting nuance here. So up here are the stated parts about what the Department for Education is responsible for. And you'll see there's a lot here actually about processes. So we're talking here about the effectiveness of the financial system. We're talking about a framework to provide assurance and a clear chain of accountability. They're interested in making sure the structures are in place to manage this correctly. And in terms of when we're developing things in terms of what we want to be doing with risk management, that's an important point. At this level, we're talking about showing people that the structure and the process is sound and will do the job. Now, within the department, there is then also an executive agency called the Education Funding Agency. They have a slightly different role within this. So you can see here there's very specific things. The EFA's accounting officer responsible to Parliament. It's talking here about being personally responsible for the regularity and propriety of the expenditure of funds, ensuring value for money. And as a way of talking about this, so one person personally responsible for £54 billion of funding each year. That's a motivator to make sure you've got systems in place that you can trust and can work in terms of doing what you need here. And if these things aren't actually happening as they should be, then the accounting officer and other senior staff within the Education Funding Agency, as well as the Permanent Secretary, will be brought in front of the Public Accounts Committee, the Education Select Committee, to talk about this. And these are becoming kind of very good media fodder at the moment. I'm sure everyone's seen either Rupert Murdoch being held up by the press, by the media committee, or Philip Green recently by the business committee. These are things that make headlines if you are pulled up there. So again, very important that you trust the way this is all working. Final challenge around this. Recently, the Department for Education published the Educational Excellence Everywhere white paper. One of the things it said in this was the move to actually expanding the amount of academy-funded schools. Under the Labour government, there were around 200 or so academies. It was a very focused niche programme. Under the last administration, that expanded to the point where there were about 5,000 or so academies. Within this white paper here, what we're talking about is expanding the academy funding model to all schools. So that's over 20,000 schools. Now, if you compare the model you might have for running 200 schools to running 20,000 schools, one way to deal with that is to scale it up 100 times and say, we need 100 times the staff we had before. In terms of managing money within government at the moment, we are unlikely to get signed off that we will get 100 times as many staff as we previously had. Therefore, you need to be working smarter, you need to be working more intelligently, you need to be making best use of the data that you have. And we've got a lot of data. We've got data on accounts, we've got data on Ofsted inspections, we've got data on school workloads, we've got data on staff salaries. We've got a huge amount there. And the point just about here is when I got bored of adding things to that slide because it was taking me all night to add things there. But the point I'm trying to make with this is that there's so much data we have around, it turns into a bit of a blizzard. You can't actually see what you're looking at there. There's so many things you need to work out where we start, and you need to be facilitating staff to be able to understand where they're going with this. I quite like this cover of The Economist. I think it's a very cute picture. But there's something absolutely key when you've got this sort of downpour of data coming through. One of the ways you can deal with it is you can subdivide lots of people, each to be looking at their own little bit of it. So you've got a section of people over here that look at the accounts data that it comes in, a section of people here who look at the staffing data who comes in, a little set of people here who look at educational performance data. And that's great because it cuts it down to manageable levels. But you're then not making linkages across those different areas. And across many, many businesses, you will see cases where each individual did the right thing with the one little bit of data and the one little bit of the world that they could see, but no one stepped back and saw that actually there was a trend you could see across all these different areas that needed pulling together. So this is one of the key things we want to be doing with this, is taking this vast amount of information we've got and synthesising it down into something that's helpful and useful to help people do their work. This is a fairly simplified slide that I'm not going to dwell on for too much. But one of the points I do want to make is with all the work we've been doing here, and for all the fancy data sciencey stuff I'm going to go on and talk about later, managing the data is the stuff that takes up the vast majority of our time here. This all comes up in slightly different formats. It all needs kind of managing and working with. And actually this bit at the middle where I talk about an analytics database and calculation engine. One of the key things behind this is it's not taking a long list of data sources and then just flinging them onto an SQL server or chucking them into Hadoop or something like that and saying, you know what, job done, the data is all in one place. It is making sure they're effectively and intelligently linked. It's about understanding actually the definitions and implications behind the data when you can compare things in a relevant way. Transforming the information you've got from raw data into meaningful indicators. There's a lot of work we've done, and I'll address this a little later in the presentation, where it's saying, okay, we've got 20 columns of data here. How do we synthesize this down into the key point that we need to make about this? We'll also come back a little later in the presentation to the bit on the right-hand side of this, where I talk about the outputs. And some of the key challenges around the fact that you need to present the data to people in a way that's right. There's a lot of great dashboard tools you can give people that are basically going down a rabbit warren. People feel like they're having a lot of intelligence with the stuff they're doing, but actually they're playing around and not coming to business decisions out of it. You can do very good tailored risk reporting and flat reports, but it needs to make sure that it's dynamic and you understand what's coming out of that. And there is a need in terms of where I'm talking about bulk data downloads to enable analysts in the business and other people to actually get access to the underlying information. So moving on a little more into specifics, we've got a lot of data, we've pulled it together into our database and we want to start doing some calculations with it. Now again, you know, we're in a new age where you want to be a data scientist and you want to be seen to be a data scientist, you want to be seen to be that unicorn out there. So actually the temptation is you dive straight into some kind of machine learning approach and you just fling it into R or Python and go for it. And you forget that actually there have been, everything in data science is built on hundreds of years of great mathematical and statistical work that, you know what, is still very valid to look at. So starting out with all the information we've got by doing the basics in terms of looking at distributions, in terms of looking at percentiles, to understand when are we getting bits of information from a school that looks unusual, that is actually an exception, that's maybe a bit of an outlier, that's something that could be a piece of concern. I've got the three distributions across the bottom there. The first one, nice and normal, we can chop that up, you know, maybe look at the sort of the top and bottom 5% around that to start saying, actually, these are unusual levels of behaviour here. The second one starts to become a bit more skewed, but we're okay with that. Third one, actually it's a very skewed bit of information then. So if I want to start looking across this and be saying, okay, when am I looking and saying this is kind of unusual behaviour for what's going on, whether this is looking at staff salaries, whether this is looking at the overall level of funds they've got in the bank at the end of the year, when do I start saying this is something we should be flagging up to the business and saying we need to look at this in a bit more detail? There's also other stuff we can do. So you can look at where things have gone wrong before with schools and then say, how does that correlate to specific items with the data? We're talking about general regression approaches there. They still have a lot of value at this point. Also importantly, again, when thinking about a data science world, we want to be doing things with the data. We want to be doing things with computers. You can forget that actually go and ask people who are on the ground about what's going on. Great example with the Trussell Trust presentation earlier about the whole point about payday loans. And actually, because you were looking at the data, You weren't actually seeing the insight because the metrics of what you were pulling in weren't exactly aligned to what was going on there. Volatility between years is absolutely key. If we're looking through this data and flagging up things of concern, we don't want to be flagging up something that next year could be entirely different because it jumps up and down a lot. There's a number of things around finances within schools which will vary a lot from one year to the other. I mentioned earlier about kind of the heating system breaking down or there being a high level of capital investment or something like that. You might see a spike within in-year funds because of specific things that are going on within a school's spend in that 1 year that aren't actually a concern with underlying problems with their business model that give us concerns about them running out of funding or them having governance issues. And also thinking about correlation between indicators, which I'll come back to in a bit more detail. This is the point where we start digging into some of the more data science stuff. So a fairly easy way to deal with a lot of the risk data we've got, and this kind of links back to the distributions I was talking about, is to draw lines in the sand. If an institution is running a deficit, we are concerned. Line in the sand. Group people into two categories. A lot of funding that institutions receive is linked to pupil numbers. So let's say if their pupil numbers drop by more than 5%, we're concerned. Split them into two categories. But actually that flings up some problems. Does that mean someone who has a 4.9% reduction in pupil numbers, we're not concerned about, but the person with 5.1%, we are? Doesn't feel right. And similarly, that the person with a 15% reduction in pupil numbers, we're concerned at the same level as the person with the 5.1% reduction in pupil numbers. Again, doesn't feel right. So what we started to do with building our way through the data is thinking about severity of risk within here. Building in things that weren't a binary yes or no, but started scaling up in terms of how concerned we are with that. And also developing in things in terms of relative weighting. Certain data items, certain indicators are better predictors than others. And this is where we got into sort of the more data science approach, using machine learning, using decision tree learning, which I'll talk about a bit more in the afternoon sessions I'm doing. But the key thing here is that these approaches are very good for being able to take that huge amount of data that we've got and look through each of those items individually and think about things about where might some of those cut-off points be where we start getting concerned that go beyond that distribution and percentile analysis that I showed before with looking at normal distributions. It can also start thinking about combinations of factors. X might be a concern, Y might be a concern, and Z might be a concern. But X, Y, and Z together are a critical concern to us that we need to know about and act on as soon as possible. There's also the element of selecting and combining variables. So here we moved into doing some stuff with principal component analysis. And what we were interested to see here is when certain types of information and bits of work go together. And we ran this twofold. We did run it on the raw data that we had, but also I was talking about some of these transformations we were doing earlier, looking at the severity of something and relative weighting around that, and having to transform that data within the analytics database engine that we've got. We could start to see there's some trends that came out. And some of the things we got were quite interesting. One of the things here, for example, flagged up Ofsted school performance tables and school admissions. So Ofsted are in charge of inspecting schools. Often they only inspect them about once every 4 years or so, but it's a very detailed view of the quality of what is happening within a school. We have a number of metrics that we produce on an annual basis for schools that form our performance tables. These go beyond just saying how many people got good GCSE grades, A star to C. They look at actually how well were these pupils performing when they came in at the end of Key Stage 2, how well are they now performing in terms of GCSEs, how much value have those schools added. We can also look at where parents are saying that they want to send their kids to school. Now, arguably, those three things should tell us exactly the same thing, because parents should want to send their kids to the best schools, in all cases, and the Ofsted inspection should just tell us exactly what we see within our metrics. And actually what we found is, yes, there are links between these three things, but they don't actually all tie up. Geographical factors make a huge difference for parents. Being able to send your child to a school which is very easy for you to get to, or is the kind of the nearest school down there, or if you're in a rural area where actually your choice is limited, that overrides anything you may well pick up on an Ofsted report for a number of people. Similarly, the Ofsted reports are only something that come through every 4 years or so, and often are done in response to database assessments they're doing. Therefore, if we're using that, we may well be using information that's quite a while out of date. So that's why it doesn't necessarily tie up with a lot of the other data indicators we've got, but the Ofsted reports go into a lot more detail. So what that was telling us is 3 things that initially we might have thought, pick one of those 3 and put it in there, told us actually we do need to be using all 3, and we need to think about how we then use those alongside each other. There's then the question of how much data we want to try and build into what we're doing here. There's a lot of work we did using stuff flagged up here, so sort of ROC curves and confusion matrices and false positives and things like that. And actually one of the key things to feed through to the business is what their risk appetite is. And actually, as an aside around this, I recently became a father. I have a 3-month-old daughter. That's why I'm medicating myself on caffeine throughout the day, because I was up most of the night with her failing to go to sleep. But one of the things that we found while you go through pregnancy now, and actually health system is great, there's something I read about, said infant mortality is now a quarter what it was in the 1980s. That is incredible and that's wonderful. Part of the reason for that is because when you're dealing with pregnancy, you have a huge amount of false positives. If they are concerned about something, they will get you in and they will check you out. You haven't felt your baby move for the last 3 hours. Call the midwife, get into the hospital, get it checked up. As soon as you go in there, the baby starts kicking like it's wanting to take part in the European Championships. The reason they do that is because they don't mind you coming in many, many times, because they want to catch the one time when there is a problem as soon as possible. Now, translating that to where we are in terms of the responsibilities I talked about at the end, do we want to be flagging up hundreds, nay, possibly thousands of academies where there might be some problem, and then actually having to kind of go and try and manage all of that with the limited staffing resources we've got as things scale up? Actually, no, because that's not going to give us bang for the buck. We're not seeing the wood for the trees there. But on the other hand, if we're talking about some of the false negatives there, we say, no, there's nothing to be worried about here. And actually there is a problem that comes up, then that's an issue as well. So again, what it's doing is finding ways to talk to the business so they understand some of the implications about this isn't as simple as a nice binary, we're going to catch everyone who's going to be an issue, and we're going to be able to flag up everyone who's absolutely fine. There is a sliding scale within this, and it's something that actually comes out naturally from a lot of the decision tree work, from actually a lot of the extensions to logistic regression, where a lot of what you're coming out with is probabilistic things, where you're saying, actually, there's a 40% chance that there might be an issue here, there's a 50% chance, there's a 60% chance, obviously with relatively high margins of error in a number of these cases. But what it's giving you the sense of saying is, where do you want your risk appetite to be? For the sort of chief accounting officer of the EFA, with that huge budget you're taking care of there, saying, do you want us to be flagging up too many? Do you want us to be flagging up too few? Where do you want us to be on that spectrum in terms of actually helping to manage the business through this? One of the other challenges we have, this is now looking across at colleges rather than academies. This is a much more stable sector. It's been managed at the kind of roughly the same size in terms of number of providers for quite a long while. And we've got some very clearly defined intervention categories. If you get an Ofsted inadequate grade, you go into our top intervention category there. If you get an inadequate financial health grade, you go into our top category. That is just the way it works. We publish that. Everyone knows that's the game. That's the way it works. That's fine. If we then start trying to do some modelling to understand what are the factors behind this, our models are immediately going to fling all that straight back at us and saying, these are the predictors of risk that's out there. Well, actually, no, they're the things that are driving what we're doing as our behaviour already. So one of the things we had to do within this was actually kind of take a step back from this and start taking out some of these key factors that we've got, in order to actually understand what else is there out there that we should be looking at. It's trying to understand a broader picture rather than just focusing on this is the way we have been running things, this is what we already know we want to be looking at. What else is there out there that may well be helping us? It's also important to learn from experience, so looking at case studies, looking at specific issues about where things went wrong. I talked before about some of the ways we were transforming the data and turning it into ways where we could flag up potential risks that are there. By doing that, what that then allowed us to do was do some quite interesting things with K-nearest neighbour analysis that allowed us to say, okay, here's a school that's hit the headlines, that's had some problems that we've gone in and had to intervene in and deal with. How many other schools out there are there like that? That's a question that comes back a lot when you have a problem with it. And because of the way that we pulled together a wide range of data, because of then trying to convert those pieces of information into meaningful metrics that are linked to risk, you can then go and apply these kind of K-nearest neighbour approaches. But without doing that transformation, what you end up doing is comparing schools for things that aren't actually particularly linked to risk. So you can say, actually, this school and this school have high numbers of let's say, a particular type of ethnicity of student going there, a high number of Asian students going there. They actually are in an area of a high level of deprivation. Were any of those things anything to do with them getting into financial difficulty? In many cases, probably not. And that's why it was important to be doing a lot of the data processing and a lot of that earlier work I was talking about that wasn't particularly data sciencey, because without doing that, actually when you then start flinging a lot of the machine learning things at it, you end up finding kind of basically spurious relationships within there. A few things to build up towards the end. So there's a bit I talked about within this about visualizing the data. Now you can do a lot of things with flat reports, throw all the information on the screen and come out with big tables of data that take up A3 pages that everyone spreads out in front of them in monthly meetings to review levels of risk. Actually, you're then asking people to do a lot of work of looking through to find the patterns, and we're back to that same problem when I was with that economist slide of just people looking in very narrow areas. You can do very clever stuff with dashboards. Looks great, gives people a lot of feeling of power. Same thing we were talking about with the M&S presentation earlier. People getting up off their backsides, putting their BlackBerry down and really getting engaged with it. The danger sometimes with dashboards is that you're misled by the feeling of power of I can click down and through and looking this, that and the other, and you're not finding the key things you need. And that's why we were trying to do quite a bit with what I refer to as dynamic formatted reports. Finding ways to pull up the key messages people need to a high level, to say these are the things you should be concerned about in this order, to then spark them being able to go back to the dashboards and delve deeper, back to the flat data reports and look across everything, but really focusing their understanding of where we want them to go. This slide I'm not going to dwell on very much because actually the M&S presentation did a brilliant job all the way across this of making most of the points I was going to say up the top end of this, so I won't repeat that. The key thing I would say are those bottom 2 points. One of the main things we found with doing a lot of work around this is try and avoid the idea of going to people and say, we are going to take you to the land of milk and honey and give you everything you need, and it's going to take us 6 months, 8 months, 12 months or something like that. So the idea of that, start small and build up. Keep coming back to the business with things that they can see and develop from there. Final aspects around this, understanding the local context. Since we aren't actually working with a series of local authorities in very focused areas, people may not know what's going on within a local area. And actually in the same way as the Trussell Trust was doing some very interesting things around mapping, we've done that. So we can see the school we've got here, we can then look at bus routes and local transport links within there. Actually, you might be able to see some of those, the red lines, which are the bus routes. There's nothing much that goes south of this school here. So when we look at the areas served, that's the cut-off point you get there. This is quite important to understanding trends in terms of where they might be going with getting extra pupil numbers and things like that. Finally, mentioned before of the data science. Go forward. There we are. Finally, mentioned the Data Science Accelerator Programme. This has actually been quite key in terms of building up data science knowledge and experience across government. I'm going to talk about it a bit more in the afternoon sessions I've got, but I did say I would give it a plug there, and it's certainly been a great piece of help for the work we've been doing. And that has been my whirlwind tour, how we are trying to manage risk. As I say, in the afternoon session, what I'm going to be doing there is going down from the high level to say, actually, with some of the things we've been doing, how are these things you can take away and implement when you get back to your desks?